Travis Toews.
All right. Well, thanks, Jerica, and welcome. It's certainly an exciting day for myself and this ministry. I believe it's a good day for Alberta. I will take a few minutes to walk you through probably what's going to be just a very high-level look at our budget, and then happy to take some questions. So the budget theme is not a new theme. Our budget theme is getting Alberta back to work, making life better for Albertans, and standing up for Alberta. This is really the theme of our platform that we presented to Albertans this spring. It's a theme and a platform that was overwhelmingly supported by Albertans. And it's a theme that has really informed the development of our budget. In terms of consultation, again, I believe the most extensive and important consultation was that consultation that we did with Albertans back in April, as we presented an extremely comprehensive platform, which has its risks, but it presented a very comprehensive platform, put it in front of Albertans, and Albertans, again, overwhelmingly endorsed it. So this budget is really the outworking. It's a budget that implements our strategic plan that Albertans endorsed last April. We did additional consultation after the election. I was fortunate to travel to a number of our key centres, met with stakeholders, met with business groups, and particularly around the McKinnon panel report, which was very helpful for me. It was very informative. I certainly had a lot of input from MLAs from across this province on budget concepts, budget ideas, concerns perhaps that their constituents had, and priorities that their constituents had around the budget. And of course, this budget was also informed by the McKinnon panel report. And I know that many of you are very familiar with that McKinnon panel report, but perhaps some of you are not. So very, very early on in our mandate, we commissioned an expert panel to take a deep dive into Alberta's finances and provide recommendations to us as a government. Recommendations around managing well the finances of the province and developing a path to balance that we could then consider and use in budget implementation. I will say this. It was a very competent panel. It was chaired by Dr. Janice McKinnon, who just so happened to be an NDP finance minister from Saskatchewan at a time when they faced even more challenging fiscal days than we are here in Alberta, and ours seemed challenging enough. Dr. McKinnon and the panel did really an excellent piece of work, provided some very, very good recommendations, and this wasn't just for providing context. I greatly valued those recommendations as we've put this budget together, and in fact, a number of the recommendations, certainly parts of them, are woven throughout our budget. This next slide shows our provincial debt and the trajectory of the debt increase that we've inherited. And as a lifelong Albertan, this graph is alarming for me, quite frankly, in terms of the trajectory of that debt. Alberta today has the highest per capita deficit and fastest growing debt of any province or state in North America. That's a severe change in direction from the fiscal heritage that we've had in this province. We are spending $5 million a day servicing that debt. That's equivalent to 30,000 teachers. That's equivalent to 35,000 long care beds. This is the really interesting one. That's equivalent to a new school every week. So debt service costs are real, and they come directly out of programs that we can be providing for Albertans. In terms of spending relative to other provinces in the country, the McKinnon panel report produced some very compelling data. It concluded that if Alberta spent the same amount of money delivering programs per capita as the average of Ontario, BC, and Quebec, we would be spending $10.4 billion less per year. We wouldn't even have a deficit. That was an amazing finding. it really squarely put focus on where the problem is. Alberta has a spending problem. And that fact has certainly informed Budget 2019. McKinnon's recommendations were that over time, Alberta should move their overall spending to be in line with the interprovincial comparators. And those are comparators with the other large provinces within Canada. Budget 2019 will do that. And this graph demonstrates that fact. Over time, over the 4 years, our operational spending will come in line with the other provinces. One other interesting finding that from the McKinnon panel was that while we're spending significantly more money delivering programs, we're not necessarily getting better results. And that was not only in education, not only in healthcare, it was virtually across the board. And so it really was great information, again, to cast a spotlight on the fact that we have to deliver better in this province. We have to look at the way we deliver programs. We have to take a look at the goal of every ministry, and where required, change our program delivery in a very substantive ways so that we can deliver better, more effectively, and more cost effectively to Albertans. We're going to take a look at our revenue projections. And you'll note that we're budgeting $50 billion in revenue for 1920. That revenue projection actually stays very flat for the following year for 2021. And then it starts to move up to $53.6 billion, and in the out year, $57.5 billion. This increase in the out years is due to what we believe will be increasing investment, additional oil sands production. And that will be related to additional egress that we have for energy products. Let me say this is not a boom time scenario. This is a very cautious revenue projection. The GDP estimates are for 2019 that we will be at 0.6% this year. So that's pretty low, pretty stagnant GDP. That will rise to 2.7 the following year, and in the out years, it will rise to 3% both years. And again, as I mentioned, these are not boom time projections. They're cautious projections, but we do expect our economy to slowly ramp up for additional investment to come into this province, which will lead to higher revenues. If we take a look at the assumptions that we've made around oil prices, again, you'll see that we have, I think, very realistic projections in front of us. We're projecting to be at $57 for West Texas Intermediate prices this year, only moving to 58 next year as an average, so really staying very flat, and then slowly climbing into the low 60s in the out years. So, you know, again, this isn't $80, $90 oil. We expect that oil prices will remain really in the range that they are in today, with maybe a slight increase. These prices and our projections are anticipating, again, additional pipeline capacity in time, certainly Line 3 coming on in the first quarter of 2021, and either TMX or Keystone XL coming on stream very late in our mandate, perhaps late 2022. We don't need both of those pipelines. We do need one. In fact, our assumptions are based on one of those pipelines getting built. But let me say this. We recognize that we live in a world of great volatility, and pipeline completion, I think, has to be one of those issues. So as we monitor our economy going forward, as we monitor our revenues going forward, if we're delayed on pipeline completion, if in fact, on the other hand, we end up in a scenario where we are looking at a global recession or something else out of our control happens that will affect our revenues, this government is very prepared to take a look at our options and move in the direction of additional spending restraint. We're committed to balancing the budget in 4 years. We're committed to presenting a very credible but realistic credible and realistic revenue projection, but should circumstances change, we will adjust accordingly. A big part of this budget actually relates to key initiatives that we are either that are underway or that we have already moved on. And again, one of the key themes in this budget is in fact jobs and the economy. We made a commitment to Albertans that we were going to implement initiatives that would increase job opportunities and improve the economy. And that's why we implemented the job creation tax cut, which basically moves our corporate tax rate from 12% to 8% over 4 years. We've also intentionally adopted the accelerated capital cost allowance provisions, which allows companies to have a quicker write-off on capital purchases that they make, which will encourage them to invest in capital, which will improve their productivity and create economic growth. We have a very significant red tape reduction effort. Modernizing our regulatory system will be key to improving our business environment. And Minister Hunter is every morning he wakes up, that's his key job, and he and his team are moving quickly on removing red tape and modernizing our regulatory environment. Let's face it, our key industries compete on the global stage. If we're going to continue to compete effectively globally, we will need to ensure that we have the most competitive business environment. A competitive and modernized regulatory environment is a key piece of that. And of course, we eliminated the carbon tax as bill number 1. And that was a tax that certainly touched every family, every individual, nonprofit, schools, but it also reduced the competitiveness of our business sector. So that is a big part of our budget today. The next slide shows, basically provides a pictorial of the fact that we will be incredibly competitive from a tax standpoint, not only within Canada, but within North America. When our when our job creation tax cut is fully implemented, we will have by far and away the most competitive jurisdiction within Canada relative to business taxes. By the time that we've arrived at 8% and that initiative is fully implemented, we will have a more competitive jurisdiction for tax purposes than 44 or 50 U.S. states. We know that we compete for capital on a global basis. And so we know the importance of ensuring that we have the most competitive tax jurisdiction. I'd like to take you to the next slide, and these are really key fiscal metrics around the budget. We've talked about the revenue projections, $50 billion this year and next, and then increasing to 53 and 57 in the out years. Operating expenses is a line that we have managed to turn down. In 18-19, operating expenses were $48.4 billion. Our 2019-2020 budget projects them at $48.2 billion. And then a slight decline next year and the following year, and basically staying flat, virtually flat into the out year. Overall, this represents a 2.8% reduction in operating expenses. It represents a 0.5% of a reduction in 2019-20. We inherited a spending trajectory on operating expenses that was an upwards trajectory of close to 4% a year. My goal was to, in fact, turn that trajectory downward in year 1 and then move it further down in year 2 and then largely hold it flat. This budget accomplishes that. We've managed to turn the trajectory from an upward trajectory of close to 4% to one that just starts to face downward. We'll look for additional savings next year and then largely hold our operating expenses flat in the out years. Within other expenses is over $600 million that the province incurred this summer to fight wildfires and deal with the emergencies as a result of those wildfires in the north. That provision is already booked under other expenses. And so our expected deficit, I will love the day when we can call it a surplus. Our expected deficit for 19-20 before other provisions and allowances is $6.5 billion, which is $200 million less than the 18-19 actuals. And now the other outlier items. We have a line for accrued by rail provision. These are the costs that we believe we may have to incur. This is the provision for a liability that we've inherited from the previous government. And that relates to the contracts related to the crude by rail effort. So we have set up a provision to deal with that liability. We did an analysis of the crude by rail effort. And to continue with crude by rail would have cost this province or taxpayers of this province at a minimum $1.8 billion. Expenses were $1.8 billion than projected revenues. That's if everything went very, very well. I can only imagine when government gets into the business of buying oil, transporting it, and reselling it, that things may not have gone perfectly, which would have greatly increased the cost even above $1.8 billion. That's one reason why we've decided to offload the crude by rail capacity. This $1.5 billion provision is likely a ceiling. I'm hopeful that, in fact, by the time these contracts by the time we have passed off these contracts, most of them to the private sector, that in fact that cost will be less than $1.5 billion. But we needed to book a liability. We needed to recognize the risk to Albertans, and so we've been fully transparent with what our liability could be on crude by rail. We have also taken a McKinnon panel recommendation around contingency for unallocated disaster assistance. The McKinnon panel recommended that our government set up a voted contingency amount that could adequately deal with emergencies and disasters going forward. In the past, governments had set up $200 million as an emergency or disasters line in the budget. We have moved that up to $750 million because historically 200 just hasn't been enough. So we've taken that step in every budget year to set up a contingency which we believe is realistic for those eventualities that tend to occur. At the end of the day, we are looking at a deficit for 1920 of $8.7 billion, largely due to the crude by rail liability that we've inherited. Over the next 3 years, of course, that deficit is reduced until in 2022-23, we're projecting a $600 million surplus, and that's after a $500 million revenue forecast allowance is included. Again, the McKinnon panel recommended that we set up basically a revenue forecast allowance, which recognizes the revenue volatility that we face as a province. They suggested only setting that up after this province has come to balance. And so that's why we've established that in the year that, in fact, we will achieve balance. The $750 million contingency amount is there as well. And so we're very pleased to deliver what will be a balanced budget in 2022-23. The next slide, I won't linger on this, but this slide really shows the operating expense trajectory that we inherited as a government and the way this budget begins to turn it down. The blue line the blue and gray line is the line that we inherited, and the dark blue line represents how we've turned it down in year one, and it will continue down, not sharply, but down slightly and then remain flat. And that will, by 2022-23, with an increase in revenues and the downward projection in operating expenses, we will achieve balance. I'm going to go to probably some of the key ministries and just talk at a very high level about the spending. In health, that is such a key ministry. It's hard to talk about fiscal responsibility without talking about health care, because it's over 40% of the entire provincial budget. We're budgeting $20.6 billion per year for health care in this province. We're including in our platform $100 million for mental health and addictions, $40 million for an opioid response, and $20 million for palliative care. That is built into the 4-year budget. These were platform commitments, and this budget honors those commitments. In education spending, Our $8.2 billion maintains current funding. It funds enrollment growth of 2.2%. And of course, like every ministry, we're seeking greater efficiency and less management costs, less overhead costs in the way we deliver services, and any resources that we can find in that effort, we intend to move to the front line. Alberta spends $11,121 per student. BC's at $9,681. Obviously, we're going to look to deliver healthcare very well, but find efficiencies everywhere we can. Our education minister will be also working on developing a new funding formula, again, based on McKinnon's recommendation, and that funding formula will be rolling out for the next school year. In advanced education, there will be a reduction in advanced education. It will be $5.1 billion, but that's down 5% from last year. It brings Alberta closer to the per capita average, and let me explain that. The McKinnon panel did a fair bit of work around health, education, and advanced education. And what they found in advanced education was that Alberta's cost, our cost to educate one full-time student equivalent, was $10,000 more per year than the average of Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec. So that's very, very significant in terms of a high cost outlier. Our goal over these next 4 years is to adjust the way we deliver education in this province, to reduce the funding requirement of government, and again, align our spend with that of our comparator provinces. One important fact to note is by the time we've followed this budget plan, after 4 years, we will still be funding full-time students at a higher rate than the average of the provinces. We will still be funding them at a higher rate. We will be lifting the 5-year freeze on tuition, but we'll be lifting it with a cap. There will be a cap of 7% tuition increases per year for 3 years, for a total of 21%. So institutions will have the ability, where they believe they need to increase tuition, but it will be capped. So over 3 years to a maximum of 21%. Again, in terms of tuition, Alberta, our tuition percentage relative to the total funding that goes into advanced education learning is much lower than the comparator provinces. As institutions begin to adjust their tuition rates over time, we believe that our tuition will begin to reflect that of the other provinces. On advanced education, we have some additional funding really to strengthen the connection between students and jobs effectively. So we will be adding $10 million over 4 years to support women building futures, which really expands apprenticeship training. We'll be increasing support for Skills Canada and Careers Next Generation by $11.4 million as well. On social services, the first thing I'll say is that there are no reductions in social services. All of the social services ministries will receive an increase, 7.6 to community and social services, 1.6 to seniors and housing, and 15% to children's services. Within children's services, we will be rolling out a new program for children and families, and that will be the Alberta Child and Family Benefit, which will replace two programs. It will replace the Alberta Child Benefit and the Family Employment Tax Credit. This new program will actually provide increased funding to our lowest income parents and families. It will also maintain the incentive to get back to work where it's possible, and so there will be additional funding as parents report employment income. And then at a certain income level, the program, of course, will phase out. This is a demonstration of changing a program to ensure that we're targeting our most vulnerable, to ensure that we're accomplishing our key goals as a ministry. The next slide demonstrates our spend to municipalities. Again, the McKinnon panel report identified that Alberta spends approximately 20% more on grant funding to municipalities than the other provinces. And as you can guess by now, their recommendation was that over time, we should move our spending to approximate that of other provinces. We've accepted that recommendation. This budget will work us in that direction, and by the end of 4 years, our spend will be very similar on a per capita basis to the spend of other provinces. Like all provinces that deliver high-quality services, Alberta has a large public sector. Again, the McKinnon panel report noted that our remuneration levels in this province and our public sector are higher than the comparator provinces. In some cases, quite a bit higher. In other cases, they were, remuneration levels were similar. But overall, we were significantly higher. And of course, their recommendation was over time to bring remuneration levels consistent with that of other provinces. So we intend to do that. This budget does not contain any provision for wage increases over the 4-year term. There will be a reduction in the size of the public service. The vast majority of that reduction will occur through attrition. And attrition is when people choose to retire or move on to a different job. And so we believe that this reduction can be, the vast majority of it can be achieved when people retire or move on to another job opportunity. As we reduce the size of the public service and the greater public sector, this will save Albertans close to $500 million, in fact, just over $500 million. We're also going to be cutting red tape within government departments, streamlining processes, updating our IT system, becoming more efficient, and moving government service delivery into the 21st century. We've estimated that over the course of time, that will save $140 million for the government and ultimately for the taxpayers of the province. I want to talk just briefly about our capital plan. Budget 2019 invests $24.2 billion over 4 years in our capital plan. In the last 10 years, our average capital spend was approximately $7 billion. Over the next 4 years, that will be adjusted downward to be just over $6 billion, about $6.2 billion a year. So we will continue to build schools. We will continue to build key infrastructure projects for the province. That's essential. And we'll continue to do that, but we will slow that spend down in a thoughtful and prudent manner. We will be continuing with the Calgary Cancer Centre, of course. The new Edmonton Hospital is still on the capital plan, although it will be delayed a few years. The Grand Prairie Hospital will get built, I trust. And there will be schools built across the province wherever there's enrollment growth and wherever they're required. The ring roads around the two large cities continue to be a priority. The Edmonton and Calgary LRT continue to remain on the long-term capital plan, but the provincial spend component is being pushed out to better reflect our fiscal situation. My last point is one that I believe has become more relevant this last week than it was when we initially started putting this budget together, and that is standing up for Albertans. Given the change of government in Ottawa, we recognize that we have to ensure that we have our fiscal house in order here in Alberta, that we are looking out for our citizens' interest in a very legitimate, tangible, and concrete way. And of course, this budget will fund the $30 million Canadian Energy Centre, or War Room, as it was termed earlier on. And that Energy Centre will be promoting and advocating about our incredibly environmentally responsible energy industry. It will be also funding, or we'll also be funding $2.5 million for the public inquiry on foreign funding of anti-energy campaigns. We believe the public needs to know where this money comes from. We will also be working very hard to ensure fiscal fairness within our confederation. Alberta is contributing now $21 billion a year in net transfers to the federal government. In the last 10 years, in the last decade, we've contributed something around $210 billion. We need to ensure that there's fiscal fairness in this country. We make large contributions, and yet when our economy turns down, as it did a few years ago, we don't see these programs reciprocate. And so we know that within the equalization formula, the fiscal stabilization cap needs to come off. There's some changes that we need within equalization to create additional fairness. We will be taking a look at every fiscal transfer that we make with Ottawa, ensuring that that there are changes where they're required. We will be certainly taking a look at equalization and working hard to ensure that that formula is fixed so that it can support our economy when times are tough. Ultimately, with equalization, I believe that that formula should be changed so that provinces have no disincentive to fully develop their resources, to fully encourage their economies to be the most productive as possible. And to get that accomplished, we will need changes in the formula. So with that, I will conclude with this. We're incredibly excited to present this budget today. Again, we believe it's a budget that really reflects the mandate that Albertans gave us last spring when they overwhelmingly supported our platform. So with that, I'll pause for any questions.
Thank you.